Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today, Great.com talks with Matt Simon, who's the Senior Legislative Analyst at the MPP.org, which stands for the Marijuana Policy Project. And if you haven't heard of them before, they are the #1 organization in the US who's legalizing cannabis. And if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to speak about how we can end the prohibition of cannabis. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great today.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I guess this episode is a little bit special. So walk us through, what kind of work is it that you're doing and why? Why is the logic behind legalizing cannabis?
Sure. So cannabis has been illegal in the United States since 1937 federally, and beginning in the 1970s, some states started to reassess that and realize that this was a failed policy. We would argue similar to alcohol prohibition having been a failed policy. People continue to use cannabis or marijuana, whichever you prefer to call it, in large numbers, but it's illegal, so there's no regulated market, and you wind up with people spending billions of dollars buying a product from illicit sources, products not tested. Consumers don't know the potency of what they're getting. They don't know whether it's contaminated with heavy metals or pesticides or molds or things like that. So we don't argue that marijuana or cannabis is harmless, but we do argue that it is less harmful than alcohol, and that if we have policies that are aimed at reducing harms, that we can produce better public policy outcomes, better public health outcomes, better public safety outcomes. So beginning in 2012, states in the United States began to legalize and regulate the sale of adult use cannabis, Washington and Colorado being the first two states. There are now 15 states where cannabis is legal in the United States. There are 36 states where it's legal for medical use. So our main focus is both at the state and federal level, trying to legalize medical cannabis, trying to legalize adult use cannabis, trying to reduce the harms around cannabis, and trying to affect regulations and policies that really do work and serve the public interest.
I think it's so interesting, the work that you do, because logically it makes a lot of sense that consumers should have the right to know what they're getting, and if the harm might be lower than alcohol, then why should alcohol be legal and marijuana should not be? And at the same time, I'm speaking to you from someone that is from Sweden, where we have quite strict laws towards marijuana, and not being able to see what happens doesn't mean that things are not happening. But at the same time, like the gut feeling from someone in my country might be that, okay, if it was legal, many more people would use it, and then that would have a harmful effect on society. Like, how true is that gut feeling?
Well, we have now 8 years of experience in Colorado and Washington, which were the first two states. And that was one of the major concerns, particularly the opponents of those initiatives believed that teen use, they were very afraid that teen use would skyrocket. And that clearly has not happened at all. And in fact, when you're regulating cannabis, you're putting it behind a counter and you're requiring an ID similar to alcohol. So it actually restricts access to young people. So teen use hasn't gone up. The one category where use has actually gone up somewhat is senior citizens. There are a lot of people over 60 who are trying cannabis for the first time, and some of them are finding that it's beneficial to them, helping with chronic pain issues, helping them sleep at night, finding that they don't need as much pain medication or don't need to take sleep medication, things like that. So, and a lot of people, a lot of adults use it responsibly as an alternative to alcohol. And alcohol can be a very problematic substance for people who are dependent on it. And if cannabis can be a safer alternative, that's one of the other ways that we see legalization is beneficial. So Colorado now has a robust market. They sold about $2 billion worth of cannabis just last year through the regulated stores in Colorado. And it is simply working well. There are no major problems associated with it. All of the doom and gloom scenarios that our opponents talked about 8 years ago have not come to pass. The state is, I mean, this has created thousands of jobs. It's provided economic opportunities, and it has resulted in a great deal of tax revenue for the state that can then be spent in various ways to offset any harms. So it's a win-win. It's proven to be that, and that's why we've been successful exporting that policy to other states, with the idea being that ultimately the federal government will change its policies, and that has been somewhat more challenging. The US Congress is kind of stuck in the past on cannabis and drug policy, and it's only recently begun to trickle up to the federal level. And just last fall, for the first time, the House of Representatives voted to pass a bill called the MORE Act that federally decriminalizes cannabis and makes it really clear that states are free to do what they want in this area of policy.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see the development that is happening. And I guess a reason some people live in the past, like you said, because I can understand the win-win. And at the same time, I know a stigma from my country is that cannabis is a drug, right? So it gets lumped into the category of drugs, which people that
So
are not...
this coffee I'm drinking.
True, true. But I can understand that there is a fear there that drug is causing problems. So
right.
to speak to someone that is holding that fear, what are the risks that you see, and how can the money that you bring in help to mitigate those problems?
Yeah. So cannabis use is problematic for some individuals, particularly underage consumers, and we support policies that restrict access to teens. But for adults, it is objectively less harmful than alcohol. Some people do become dependent on cannabis, but it is a lower percentage than people who become dependent on alcohol. And cannabis dependence is generally much less severe than alcohol dependence. It is alcohol withdrawal can be fatal. It's very problematic drug when we look at it that way. We'd like to think that once upon a time, all of the nation's best scientists and doctors got together and looked at all of the available drugs that people were using and tried to understand what are the harms, what are the benefits, and how do we make policies that are rational and sensible based on those relative harms. That is not how drug policies were developed in the United States, and that's not how global drug policy was developed historically. It's really only in the last 20, 30 years that it's become a policy issue that we look at as any other policy issue that driven by science, driven by data rather than by fear. In the United States, it's always been closely associated with, you think of the word marijuana, it's a Mexican slang term, and cannabis is the scientific term that I prefer to use. Of course, I work for an organization that has the word marijuana in the name, and that's a reflection of when MPP was founded 25 years ago. Most people didn't know the word cannabis at all. It was just marijuana, and it was just a bad drug. The medical benefits had been forgotten, pretty much lost to history or erased from history, more accurately. And people didn't realize that from about 1850 to 1937, cannabis was available as a pharmaceutical drug. It was available in pharmacies. People were using it for chronic pain, insomnia, seizure disorders, and many of the same reasons they're using it today. And there was an orchestrated propaganda campaign in the 1930s to demonize the plant, demonize people who were using the plant. And it resulted in, all of that knowledge being pretty much ripped out of the medical textbooks. Cannabis was removed from the pharmacopoeia. Doctors stopped learning about it. And, it developed a very bad reputation. And then in the 60s, we had counterculture and all of that. And people started using cannabis more, but it was associated with the anti-war movement. It was associated with hippies, subcultures, and real Americans drank alcohol. And it was only those people, including Black and brown people, people who were against war, people who were politically seen as fringy in one way or another, that were associated with cannabis. So it's taken a long time for organizations like MPP to change that narrative, to get people to view cannabis objectively through the same lens that we view other substances. And through that lens, it's clear that regulation is just a better policy than prohibition.
Right. So you have the data now, and you have an understanding of how to make sound policies. What are the challenges you're facing to make them become reality? Is it to change people's mindsets? Is it a political challenge? Maybe they're connected, but what are the steps to make it happen?
Yeah, they're closely connected. I mean, obviously, public opinion had to change, and that's where we've been tremendously successful, is changing public opinion. When I started working for MPP 10 years ago, it was about 1/3 of Americans supported legalization, and now it's 2/3, maybe a little over 2/3. So support for adult use legalization has doubled in just the last decade. With medical cannabis, one by one, patients had the guts to come forward and say, hey, I'm using this illegal drug and it's helping me more than what my doctor prescribed. And enough patients came forward to get doctors to take it seriously, and they started studying it. There's still tremendous barriers to research. If you're a doctor in the United States, a scientist that wants to study the medicinal benefits of cannabis, it's difficult to get approval. Still to this day, it's easy to get approval if you're looking for the harms, and it's hard to get approval if you're looking for benefits. And so Dr. Sanjay Gupta is a very well-known and respected physician in the US, and he's now CNN's chief medical correspondent. And so he did a series of documentary films that explored the medicinal benefits of cannabis, and that had a big impact in educating people to the fact that this plant does have positive uses. In particular, there was a little girl with severe epilepsy who was using cannabis oil, and nothing else stopped her seizures. Cannabis oil was the only thing that helped her stay alive and live a normal life. And that story touched so many Americans and got them to realize, well, we have to at least allow it for medicinal uses. And then the more people learn about it, the more they realize it doesn't make sense to have anybody ever be arrested for their decision to use cannabis. As long as you're not supplying underage people or trafficking large amounts or something like that, you should not be. Our criminal justice system should not be focused on that. And this is where it ties in with the war on drugs and mass incarceration. You may know that the United States has about 5% of the world's population, but we have about 25% of the world's prison population.
Wow.
Over 2 million people incarcerated in the United States. And historically, the war on drugs has been a huge driver on that, and it's been primarily focused on Black and brown people in marginalized communities. It's a very disproportionate impact. So there's a fairness element here and an equality element here. For white people in the suburbs, cannabis is already pretty much, you're probably not going to get arrested for it. It's quasi-legal and has been for a long time. But if you're a poor person or a Black person that lives in a city that's, or an area, a neighborhood that's heavily policed, you might wind up being arrested many times. And if you live in New York City during the era of stop and frisk, when it was police policy to just shake people down on the street and get them to empty their pockets and charge them with a crime for having a joint in their pocket, it was a way to keep marginalized populations marginalized. And that's one of the major motivators in trying to end this.
Yeah, there's a feeling of sadness and frustration to hear those numbers and that is happening. So I really hope that you can be part of a transformation into something better.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that's already happening. The arrest rates have gone way down, and with each state that comes on board, now that we've changed public opinion to the large extent that we have, even the most conservative states, there's majority support for legalization. So then it's a matter of actually changing the laws, and that's where we come in. That's our motto, in fact, is we change laws. So my department is the State Policies Department. We focus on lobbying state legislatures. In about half of the United States can put a question like this directly on the ballot for voters to consider. So Colorado and Washington were cases where voters approved legalization. The politicians were not even close to ready for it in 2012, but we were able to put it directly on the ballot in those states. And it's only very recently that we've been able to convince state legislators who tend to be, older, more conservative, more kind of establishment. They tend to have relationships with law enforcement and with substance abuse people who are not so in favor of this. So it's been a tougher hurdle to get over. But we're to the point now where even, in the last election, 4 more states voted to legalize, and that included 2 pretty conservative states, South Dakota and Montana. So if we can win in those states, we can win just about anywhere. And then it's just a matter of getting the federal government to go along with this trend that is sweeping from one state to the next. So I'm very optimistic. It's if you follow U.S. politics, there's a lot to be upset about sometimes, and a lot of
it's been fun to watch this year. Jesus.
Oh my goodness. But I feel blessed to be working on one issue where we are absolutely making tremendous progress. And, it used to feel like pushing a boulder up a mountain. And now it feels like we're going down the other side of the mountain, and we've got a little bit of wind at our backs, and it's just a matter of time and effort till we're able to achieve all of our goals as an organization. And someday we won't have to exist. That's my hope. I'm trying to work myself out of a job over here.
And you come to Sweden.
It sounds great. I'd love to do that.
So how has what has changed then with the new Biden administration? Is there a big difference for you, or?
That's a good question. Joe Biden himself has been in government for a very long time. He was in the U.S. Senate for about 40 years, and he's somebody who was not on board with reforming cannabis laws at all until pretty recently. But he's the platform that they ran on was supporting federal decriminalization, leaving cannabis policy to the states, which is a big evolution for him personally from where he was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But it seems like they're serious about that. But the U.S. Senate is still very divided. It's 50-50, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, with the vice president casting the tie vote. And it's unclear how much they're going to be willing to do in the next year or two. We still have our work cut out for us, definitely, with the U.S. Congress. Some of the Democrats are in their 80s and 90s and have been against legalizing
Mhm.
cannabis for their entire lives. So we've still got some work to do, but we're doing it.
It's going to be exciting to see how. I have an assumption that the plant is going to play its part in also changing the mindset of the American population to something that might be, I don't know, maybe a little bit more softer. And but who knows? That's just me speculating. So we're coming towards the end of this interview now, and I'm curious, what can someone do both to keep an update on how you guys are doing and what the evolution is in the US, but also what can they do to support your cause if they think this is important?
Yeah, absolutely. So mpp.org, you mentioned, is the website. We're obviously on Facebook and Twitter and all those social media platforms. So following MPP, we're always sending, if people live in the United States, unfortunately, our work is limited to the United States, but our belief is that changing law in the US will result in beneficial changes globally. And we're already starting to see that. Mexico's looking at legalizing. Canada beat us to it. The United States played historically a major role in forcing cannabis prohibition on the rest of the world through international treaties and as part of US foreign policy. So by legalizing in the United States, we change the United States' position in the world from one of trying to make other countries prohibit cannabis to one of saying, hey, it's okay to change because we did and it's fine. And I think that's a big deal. People can support us financially. We certainly need all the help we can get on that front because the campaigns that we run cost a lot of money. So on that front, we're actually two organizations. There's MPP, which is the political advocacy organization, and there's MPP Foundation, which is a nonprofit. Well, I mean, they're both nonprofits, but in the U.S., there's a separate designation for an educational organization. So for somebody who pays taxes in the US, donations to the MPP Foundation can be tax deductible. And supporting either MPP or MPP Foundation is money that goes directly to this work of trying to educate people and trying to change laws.
Beautiful. Matt Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. I highly appreciate it.
Emil, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this interview, if you thought it was important, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithm that this conversation is important, so more people out there can learn about the importance of changing cannabis laws. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.